The impacts of economic sanctions on global oil trade. Let's say I make a category over here, both from the perspective of global economics and global politics. What are the impacts of the economic sanctions on global oil trade? Naturally, what happens is basically something like this. Now, take a look at this. You have Europe, right? You have Russia. You have, let's say, for example, here India. And you have China. Okay. And also, you have the major supplier of oil in the world, what are known as the OPEC countries, right? These are the major oil reserves of the world. Okay. Now take a look at how this entire situation in a way develops. Right. The first thing that you get a sense in this sense is basically how it happens here. That let's say when oil starts moving, the oil which is coming from Russia to Europe. Okay, this oil trade is entirely thwarted. Right. So khatam kar diya hai. When oil is moving from Russia to Europe and when this oil trade is entirely busted out, right, which means what is going to happen? First of all, you will have deficit of oil in Europe, a rising deficit of oil in Europe. This is going to be the case, that deficit is going to rise in Europe. Okay, and also at the same time you will see a surplus oil rising in Russia. These two markets have been disconnected from each other, so you have a deficit of oil here, you have a surplus of oil here. This deficit starts looking at this market for its supply, which lead to a kind of a revival of Europe OPEC energy trade. OPEC was a partner of Europe in energy trade before the 1990s, before Russia replaced them. And since 1990s, it is Russia that is supplying more or less all the oil for the European countries. But now, since the developments over here, you see a revival of the Europe OPEC energy trade, which leads to a kind of a movement of oil from the OPEC countries into here. So of course you have OPEC as a supplier, and the work of the supplier is to create a what you can call response to the demand. Now since supply of oil at Europe starts beginning, it creates a kind of a short supply of OPEC countries to countries like India and China, right? So you have a short supply of oil. The oil is diverted into the other regions, and therefore because of the short supply of oil that happens with regard to Europe and the Indian and Chinese regions, in these instances what you see is a very simple logic, that if demand remains constant, and the supply of oil decreases. So by applying the simple logic of the demand and supply formula, what is going to be the price of the oil? The price of the oil is going to shoot up, which was also known as the oil crisis. The government of India has described this part as fuel crisis or oil crisis. So as soon as the European market turns to the OPEC to supply the oil, which was erstwhile being supplied by Russians, OPEC oil, as it starts, moving into Europe, the supply of oil that the OPEC countries were doing traditionally to India and China starts shutting down. And as the supply of oil decreases, you see a constant rise in the demand. You see the demand is constant and supply of oil decreases. As a result, very categorically, you see a jump in the oil prices. Oil prices start taking a huge, massive jump, causing a kind of a bit of a crisis in India with regard to oil. This was about 2022 September, October, when oil prices, for example, in the National Capital Territory in Delhi, it had touched about 122, 123. So this was what is a massive oil price that was happening over here. Now, as a result of this particular situation, two things happen to, in a way, respond to this, and also as a consequence of this. Russia starts supplying its oil, which is in surplus, to China, and the pipeline that is existing between the Russians and the Chinese is known as the power of Siberia. Now, this is another part that you have to pay slightly focus at. After the annexation of Crimea in 2014, when the Russians had annexed Crimea in 2014, Crimea is a peninsula in the Black Sea under Ukraine. After the annexation of Crimea in 2014, European Union had threatened Russia of imposing complete sanctions upon Russia in oil. So that was a threat that was given to Russia by the European Union, that if the Russians don't stop aggression against Ukraine, then they are going to impose sanctions against Russian oil, meaning they will stop buying Russian oil. It was at this point of time that the Russians and the Chinese entered into an agreement for a possible oil trade, because then the Russians understood that if they are going to attack Crimea or attack Ukraine again, it may possibly lead to a putting up of economic sanctions, right? If they're going to attack Ukraine, there is going to be a possibility of economic sanctions, which means Russia will not be able to access the market of Europe as easily as it could have done before. Okay, so the question that rises, meaning the question that stands at the center of this entire activity is with this, that when the Russians understood that Europe is not going to be a viable market for a very long time if Russia wants to attack Ukraine, the Russian and the Chinese developed a structure of pipeline known as the power of Siberia. And after the sanctions were imposed by the Europeans upon Russians, oil started moving from Russia to China through the power of Siberia. And currently, as possibly a lot of you would know, that China is the largest importer of Russian oil today. So all the Russian consumption, Russian energy which was being exported to Europe till the time, is now diverted towards China. And that is what basically keeps the Russian economy afloat even in the middle of sanctions, as these activities are happening in such a manner that the Chinese are able to back up the Russian oil supplies which were previously being sent to Europe, right? And this is where power of Siberia starts coming in. And the second thing that happens, which is equally interesting in this particular aspect, is that a lot of Russian oil is now getting diverted to India. You see, Russian oil starts moving towards India, and at this point of time, India and Russia enter into agreements by which Russia promised it to sell India oil at discounted prices. And this is when Indian market starts getting a supply of oil. As the short supply of oil through the OPEC countries is compensated by the discounted oil provided by Russia to India, at this point of time, oil enters into Indian market, and the demand and supply disequilibrium, which had raised the prices of oil, comes and stabilizes slightly. And this is exactly how the entire global economy in a way changed and reacted with regard to the sanctions which were imposed by European Union upon Russia. Do you see the point, class? Class, is this logic entirely clear to you? So we are going to discuss a few points with regard to our prelims specific questions. We have the power of Siberia pipeline. We have the Russia-India oil trade, and we'll just take a look at the figures of Russia and India recently, specifically with regard to the oil trade between the two countries, and how is India's oil imports functioning currently. You see the point over here, class?